Six-Day War, Part 1, Conflict Background. Shalom guys, today I'll tell you about the Six-Day War, how and why it started, the balance of power and plans of the parties involved, and how it all impacted the subsequent history of the region. Spoiler, we're still dealing with the consequences. Firstly, a traditional lyrical digression. Most people judge the Six-Day War very superficially. Initially, they look at the Wikipedia comparison of forces. Jews, 264,000 troops, of which only 50k are regular forces. The rest are reservists. 300 aircraft, actually combat ready about 200, and 900 tanks. Arabs, 500,000 troops, 1,000 aircraft, 2,500 tanks, but in reality their forces were much more modest. More on that later. Then we look at the comparison of losses. Jews from 500 to 1,000 casualties and about 50 aircraft. Arabs 20k casualties, 10k prisoners, and 400 aircraft. And here come the armchair militaries claiming that Arabs are not human, Jews are Superman, or that anyone could handle Arabs, but we would have beaten the Jews, and so on. In reality, everything is much more complex and interesting. So let's go back to May 1967. 11 years ago, the Suez Crisis ended, during which the Allied forces of England, France and Israel gave the Egyptians a hard time. After such humiliation, Arabs were filled with vengeful feelings. And then good old Grandpa USSR stepped in. Moreover, Grandpa has a bunch of various toys from MiG-21 to T-55 in his arsenal, and he's ready to hand them over to the valiant fighters against world imperialism for mere pennies or even credit for 10,000 years, which someone like Putin will forgive later. Arabs realized that fortune favored them and began to stock up through the Soviet military trade, promising to settle the score as soon as they pushed the Jews into the sea. By 1967, Arab countries, primarily Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Morocco and Lebanon, possessed powerful and modern armed forces, collectively suppressing Israel in all aspects. However, only Egypt could stand alone against Israel. The other countries had no chance individually, and could only hope to deal with Israel in the format of a broad coalition. During the period from 1956 to 1967, there were regular local clashes between Arabs and Jews. Shelling, tank and even aerial battles occurred frequently, with various terrorist attacks almost daily. Israel's main friction was with Syria, over the Sea of Galilee, the main source of fresh water for Israel. The Jews wanted to divert part of the water for irrigation in the Negev desert, while the Syrians also wanted to divert part of the water to prevent it from reaching the Jews, to Waltz, to Shapiros, as they say. Obviously, before the war, Israel was in an extremely vulnerable position. 70% of the Israel population lived on the coast between Tel Aviv and Haifa, just 30 kilometers from the Jordanian border. The border with Egypt was the Negev desert, an uninhabited territory challenging to defend. In the north, the Golan Heights controlled by Syria allowed them to shell the Jewish shore of the Sea of Galilee. With such conditions, Israel physically couldn't withstand a simultaneous attack by a united Arab coalition. Well, it could resist, but avoiding catastrophic material and human losses was out of the question. Jews understood this well, so the military leadership began developing a plan for a preemptive strike since the late 1950s, in case of the formation of an Arab coalition. The political leadership of Israel, on the contrary, hoped to avoid the conflict, as they didn't believe in Israel's quick and bloodless victory and tried primarily to prevent the formation of such a coalition. The government was confident that King Hussein of Jordan wouldn't be able to negotiate with Egyptian President Nasser, who participated in the overthrow of Egyptian King Farouk. because they fiercely hated each other. However, Israelis missed the fact that both of these characters were equally disliked by Jews. Similarly, hopes were dashed that Egyptians would not be able to reach an agreement with the Syrians. It is a murky story. Both countries were part of the United Arab Republic, UAR, like the Union State of Russia and Belarus, only more damaged and useless. Despite all the contradictions, the sides entered into a military alliance in November 1966. In general, the rhetoric of the Arab media at the time was quite uniform. In short, throw the vile Zionists into the sea. In Egypt, a full-scale military hysteria began. The Minister of Religious Affairs even issued directives to mosques, urging the congregation to understand that jihad and dying for Allah are great honors. This is not surprising even today. Muslims regularly release new fatwas with calls to punish someone. What is surprising is that even the head of the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, Pope Kirill VI, did not stay on the sidelines. He fully approved all the steps taken by Egypt to reclaim Palestine from those who crucified Christ. The crisis was slowly escalating, and then wise USSR, with their cycles and hammers, added a little fuel to the fire, all with the best intentions trying to prevent war. In late April, after a series of shelling and terrorist attacks, an aerial battle took place between the Israel and Syrian air forces, as well as a tank battle and a series of mutual artillery bombardments. To prevent new provocations, the Jews declared their readiness to invade Syria. They often made such statements and regularly invaded Syrian and Jordanian territories, pursuing Palestinian militants. Whether a powerful raid was really being prepared this time, or Soviet intelligence decided to exaggerate, but on May 13, 1967, the Soviet government notified Syria and Egypt that the Jews had brought up to 13 brigades to the border. Most likely, this is a very inflated figure, as the Jews would hardly allocate 75% of their manpower for war with Syria and leave the Egyptian and Jordanian directions. Israeli sources say that the border was covered by a reinforced platoon of 130 people, but this is not even funny. In any case, the Syrians panicked and demanded guarantees from Egypt that they would intervene for them. Egypt gave assurances and called for support throughout the Arab world, claiming that the Jews were bullying the little ones. By May 14, Egypt and Syria declared mobilization. Israel, thinking it could weather the storm, decided not to give in provocations. But when on May 16 Egypt demanded the withdrawal of peacekeepers from the border, even the most pacifist-minded Jews began to realize that they might be beaten, possibly even with their feet. Following this, Jordan and Yemen also declared mobilization, well, just for company. The final expulsion of United Nations peacekeepers from Egyptian territory on May 18, 1967, made war almost inevitable. Note that the Blue Helmets, about 1,000 people in total, mostly Canadians and Danes along the entire border, effectively prevented regular mutual provocations, but at least they guaranteed the demilitarized status of border territories and the absence of heavy equipment on them. Now the Jews were preparing to repel an attack from Egypt at any moment. Meanwhile, peacekeepers were literally kicked out at gunpoint, and the United Nations just wiped its hands and did not react to such a move. On May 18, after the hasty withdrawal of United Nations forces, Cairo Radio Voice of the Arabs announced, "From today, there are no more extraordinary international forces protecting Israel. We will no longer show restraint. We will no longer complain to the United Nations about Israel. The only method of influence that we will apply to Israel is total war, which will result in the destruction of the Zionist state." On May 22, 1967, Egyptians landed on islands in the Gulf of Aqaba and blocked Israeli access to the Red Sea. On the same day, a ban on the passage of Israeli ships and ships carrying goods to Israel through the Suez Canal was announced. And here the Jews, feeling threat to their business, rushed to complain to the United Nations. The United Nations, as usual, could not help, and the United States and Britain decided to limit themselves to moral support, strongly recommending that the Jews not be the first to start. On May 25, the Minister of Defense of Egypt went to Moscow, where he asked the senior comrades for permission to hit Tbilisi, or at least Tel Aviv. The Soviets did not want war at that time, so they demanded that Egypt abandon a preemptive attack on Israel and give the initiative to the Jews in starting hostilities. At the same time, the USSR promised to intervene if the Americans joined the banquet. From May 26 to 29, Sudanese and Algerian troops approached Egypt, and the Saudis promised to join the war if Israel made even a move toward the Arab brothers. Iraq began to relocate its air forces closer to Israel. On May 30, Egypt and Jordan signed a military alliance. Jordanian forces came under the command of the Egyptian General Staff, and Iraqi tanks entered Jordan. From this moment on, the Jews just started panicking. It should be understood that the population of Egypt alone in 1967 was approximately 33 million, while the population of Israel was about 3 million. Egypt could easily keep about 100 soldiers on the border without much difficulty for the economy, and this is without mobilization. The regular army of Israel totaled 50,000. There were about 200,000 reservists of a decent level, but keeping them constantly under arms would ruin an already not very healthy economy. Therefore, a month before the start of hostilities, the Jews began to mobilize reservists, organizing short, 2-week gatherings directly at the positions of combat units. During all this time, starting from mid-May, Israeli diplomats roamed to the west, convincing their respected partners that they did not want war, but they would not tolerate closed shipping and the concentration of Arab troops nearby. In the course of consultations with the Soviets, the Americans seemed to have agreed that they had enough of Vietnam, so neither they nor the Soviets would introduce their troops into the conflict zone. The British also expressed only moral support, although they declared increased readiness on ships in the Mediterranean. Any serious results were not achieved by Israeli diplomacy, but they did manage to present themselves to the West as victims. In the first days after the start of the war, while the scale of the Arab coalition defeat was not yet clear, Western countries took a quite friendly position towards Israel. In short, by the beginning of June, the situation for Israel looked as follows. The combined forces of Egypt, Syria and Jordan, with the support of limited contingents from allied Arab countries, the largest being Iraq, with 200 relatively modern aircraft, 400 tanks and a bunch of troops, but others could also contribute something, were ready to strike at the Jews from 3 sides. Moreover, the Jordanian and Iraqi armies were only 30 kilometers from the most densely populated areas of Israel, meaning there was no depth of defense against them. The enemy had a significant numerical superiority, and this superiority was growing every day. The Egyptian General Staff was slowly but surely improving cooperation between allied forces. To have any chance of conducting operations against such a coalition, Israel had to keep all reservists under arms, which is half of the entire male working age population of the country, which was extremely costly for the economy. There was nothing to expect from allies. The United States and Britain were busy in Vietnam and had no time for Israel. The conclusion suggests itself that waiting for the Arabs to gather strength, work out cooperation, and still strike Israel would be an extremely bad idea. In the given situation, what did the Jews do? As I mentioned earlier, there was a fierce conflict between doves and hawks in the Israeli government. The doves initially cheeped that the Arabs would never be able to unite, then that foreign countries will help us, and then that the West will not appreciate it if we start a war. The hawks, on the other hand, claimed that they should strike first and promised that they would hit the Arabs on the first day with minimal losses. The doves were then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and the hawks were former Prime Minister Ben Gurion. The more imminent the threat of war became, the stronger the positions of the hawks. If on May 24, Shimon Peres, a comrade of Ben Gurion and from 2007 to 2014, the president of Israel tried to oust Eshkol through the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, but could only gather 50 votes out of 120. By May 30, after receiving information about the alliance between Egypt and Jordan, negotiations began on the creation of a national unity government in which the Hawks took leading positions. On June the 1st, Moshe Dayan, a fifth Hawk, who led the troops during the Suez Crisis in 1956, was appointed Minister of Defense and immediately approved the plan for a preemptive strike against the Arabs. The appointment of a war hero popular in the army and among the people instilled confidence in the already disheartened Jews. Ironically, Dan himself was quite skeptical and not confident in an easy victory, but even before his official appointment, he made a major inspection trip to military units and began implementing the plan for a preemptive attack on Egypt. There were 80 hours left until the start of the war.